Hi everyone, it's Ren here, and in this video we're going to be talking about philosophy. I would like to discuss the question of immanent space in Open Monism. So, as you know, perhaps not all of you know because I have had new subscribers since I made my last video on Open Monism, but I am a philosophizing person. Philosophy is my passion, and I'm currently working on a system, an original system philosophy in which I try to, broadly speaking, reconcile various strands of existentialism with strands of metaphysical monism, the commitment to the idea that the substratum of the world or substratum of the universe is one and open, and that it is a monism of being. So you have on the one hand the monism of being, and on the other the commitment to being in actuality as doing, very similar to the existential commitment. And progressively throughout my thinking, I have come to embrace a concept that is very important in Open Monism, which is the concept of immanent space. And in this video I would like to, if not manage to completely explain it perfectly, because this is very hard for an NI-DOM, and this is a little wink to my INFJ friends. It's very hard to explain it, but I think that I can at least attempt to provide a picture of it, in addition to the picture that I've already given of it numerous times in my writing. So the way in which I represent immanent space, if you like, is, well, it is a space in the sense that it is that across which the units of the factual units have coordinates. In other words, if you consider that the domain of being is purely immanence, that it is not transcendence, then therefore all of that which either takes place or is capable of taking place must belong in the same space of being, right? You could sort of picture it that way. They must all have coordinates across in the same space. If they do not, then it means that there are different spaces, and if there are different spaces, and you can picture a space in terms of a metaphysical space here. If you have different metaphysical spaces in which things that take place have coordinates, well, this suggests transcendence, and this also suggests pluralism. Well, either the most basic form of pluralism, which is metaphysical dualism, or if there are more than two spaces, what you have is metaphysical pluralism. Now, I'm a monist, and therefore I commit to the existence of only a single space in which things that take place have coordinates, immanent space. So the question becomes how to define immanent space. Well, the way that I like to define it is to say anything that takes place, has taken place, or can take place. How can it be reduced? How can it be reduced to, if not an essence, because I reject essence in Open Monism, but how can it be reduced to an entelechy, that is, to a potential? It's quite striking straight away, I think, that the concept of a potential is a prima facie a good reduction of this idea of what can take place, or what has taken place, what takes place. Because you can picture a potential as being sort of a thing which can expand, and you can sort of picture the expansion as being the taking place, or just lying there until it expands. However, what's there prior to the expansion is already the whole thing, and the expansion would only be in a sense the actual manifestation of the potential that was always there. And immanent space I call a virtual space, in the sense that it is the space in which the potentials have their coordinates. So it's not really only what takes place that has the coordinates. It's what takes place in potential, and therefore the coordinates of fact and virtual space are coordinates of units of potential taking place, including actual taking place, because, and this is very important, the actual taking place of a factual unit or a factual unity, which is an event or a situation, does not exhaust the possibilities of the potential taking place of it. So the actualization of an entelechy does not constitute its negation. It's actually part of the entelechy. You have different stages to an entelechy, different stages of potential realization. And because being extends across time, because it elongates along presence in the world, there is no established finitude to being, and therefore there's never any question of the potential that being as a whole is being completed. So it is a constant realization of a potential that does not seem to have finite bounds. I mean, it has finite bounds in terms of it being real, as it cannot be logically inconceivable, but it does not have finite bounds in terms of the giving of actuality by virtue of the attributes of immanent givenness. And it follows from this that across immanent space, which is a virtual space, like I said, you have a potential infinity of factual units, which, in order for them to be part of the space, all that is required is that as potential units of taking place, they are logically conceivable. If they're not empirically conceivable, that is, from our perspective, because only human beings or beings in the actual world that we know can speak about empirical conceivability from their stance, it might be very possible that in another possible world, in another virtual world, in immanent space that has its own coordinates as combining a very, very large amount of factual units into a unity which constitutes another world. Perhaps from the point of view of that world, what does not come across as empirically conceivable from our perspective comes across as empirically conceivable from the perspective of the other world. So empirical inconceivability is not enough in Open Monism to constitute irreality, nothingness, non-being, which means that what is empirically inconceivable may very well still be in immanent space, the condition only being that it be logically conceivable. So if there is something that is transcendent in Open Monism in some way, and this echoes the quote by Wittgenstein that logic is transcendental, it is that it is logical conceivability, but it is not. It is actually not transcendental. It's just because one way of putting it, but I think it's a figurative way to say it's transcendental. But for me, there's nothing transcendental about logic. It only means that because it is immanent in everything that is part of the space, it's logically conceivable. So everything that is that has coordinates across virtual immanent space is logically conceivable. And logical conceivability are really the bounds, the limits of that space, right? It's all it is. There's nothing really transcendental except in a manner of speaking, in a figurative manner of speaking about logic. in relation to the immanent space, which represents the content of being. Because as you remember, one of the aspects of being next to reality and structure is content, and the content of being can be represented across that immanent space. Total immanent space is the space in which the content of being has coordinates, and they're virtual coordinates because they're potential coordinates. Like they're not potential coordinates. They're real coordinates of potential realization into actuality, which to me in Open Monism equates to what I call virtuality. So you can imagine that space is very large. It's very, very big. It's quite hard to tell what are its limits, apart from setting its limits as those of logical conceivability. And perhaps this is perfectly fine to define the space of the limits of the space of being. But let us keep in mind one of the important insights that are associated with this. And one of the important insights in question is that that we may not be the only world, because we're not the only logically conceivable world, which means that any other world that is logically conceivable can happen, and perhaps is happening, except that from our own empirical perspective, which is the stance from the world that we are in, we may not be able to empirically conceive of those other spaces. That does not mean that they are impossible, and that does not even necessarily mean that they are unactualized. But from our perspective, we can only see from a certain standpoint, which is our standpoint, which is not the whole standpoint of being. In a sense, the perspective from total being, which would be the equivalent in theology of the perspective of God, would be the perspective that can see everything that does take place. But this is not our perspective, and it's only a product of the fact that we, from our perspective, we take place, and in taking place, we are limited in some sense by the situation of our own actuality and of our own coordinates in virtual space. We are only seeing from our stance in virtual space, not from the totality of virtual space. Okay? The totality of virtual space is the totality of being. That's not accessible to our perspective, but we may intuit it by phenomenological analysis from where we are, which is what I do in Open Monism. So that was my little, hopefully not completely obscure and unclear expose about how I conceive of immanent space. All right, let me know what you think, guys. See you soon.